Imagine this. It's late, the city hums its tired hymn, and you're in your apartment watching the orange spill of streetlights smear across wet asphalt. The distant rumble of a metro, a car horn, the small, predictable noises of a city that keeps pretending nothing has changed, then the lights die. Not a flicker, not a failing bulb, a patient, total pull of current. Your building, the block, the skyline, all folding into a single, absolute dark. For a long, strange beat, there is no sound at all, and then the sirens begin their long, thin cry. That was the night Moscow learned it could be unlit. Hold that image. A capital of 12 million swallowed by darkness that was not the weather's doing or a faulty transformer. It was the consequence of hundreds of drones crossing borders, of a deliberate campaign aimed not merely at metal and wire, but at the very perception of invulnerability. The city that told itself it was shielded from the war saw its myth collapse in a single blackout. And with that collapse, everything the myth supported, authority, narrative, the sense that suffering belonged to someone else, began to shift. 22nd main idea, spoken like a prophecy. The war's tempo just changed. Ukraine's drones turned light into leverage. When capitals go dark, the front lines are no longer maps, but the shadows between sockets. Get used to a new rhythm. Distance no longer guarantees safety, and power is measured by who can innovate under pressure. Remember that. You start small and sensory, because people remember what they feel before what they know. The small details, the stale microwave hum that fades, the sudden black rectangle where a television used to glow, the slippered foot on a tiled stair trying to find a handrail in the dark are the hooks that force empathy. From those hooks, you widen outward. One apartment, one tunnel, one train car becomes an entire pattern. For 2 years, the story had been a simple, brutal rhythm. Russia strikes, Ukraine endures, Russia invades, Ukraine defends. Predictability breeds a certain cold, efficient narrative. Then the rhythm was interrupted. Ukraine's engineers and volunteer units pushed the battle out of the trenches and into the sky above cities once thought beyond reach. They used low-cost, modified machines, hobbyist frames, off-the-shelf components, a blend of scavenged parts and open-source code welded into persistence. They stopped trying to make each strike decisive and instead chose repetition, endurance, saturation. Hundreds of inexpensive machines launched in waves, so the best defenses, designed for singular, expensive missiles, choked on abundance. The result was not only damage, but cognitive rupture, the sensation that the normal rules no longer applied. That sensation is the strategic victory. The campaign's theater was both technical and psychological. Technically, the goal was tactical denial, hit the arteries that sustain war. Power, plants that feed bases, pipelines that carry fuel, depots where munitions are stored and repaired. Psychologically, the aim was to collapse the story of immunity. In the Kremlin's narrative, Moscow was the fortress, a warm hearth insulated from the chaos it exported. When cities hundreds of kilometers from the front lines suffered outages, the Kremlin could soothe the populace with staged images of stability. The lights were on here. The state still administered order. That story broke when the lights went out at home. People stopped watching the war from a safe distance and started feeling it in their bones. That literal darkness forced an existential recognition. If the state could not protect the most basic comforts, heat, light, mobility, then what else might it fail at? Those are the first cracks in a regime that trades heavily on the performance of control. But this campaign was not merely revenge or theatrical cruelty. It was strategic clarity. Ukraine recognized that asymmetric power does not always require parity of weaponry. It requires parity of consequences. If Russia used infrastructure strikes to try and freeze a nation into submission, Ukraine would reply in kind, not by targeting civilians directly, but by targeting the machinery that powers military logistics and domestic morale. The aim was not to replicate pain for its own sake, but to create deterrence, to demonstrate that vulnerability is reciprocal. And in that reciprocity lies a new form of deterrent, one that is cheap, distributed, and hard to negate with the expensive air defense systems designed for a different age. There is a practical anatomy to how this is done. Engineers with access to open-source satellite imagery and public procurement data can map the grid with surprising accuracy. They can identify substations whose failure cascades into far larger outages and chain attacks so that one failure triggers another before defenders can respond. Drones fly low to reduce radar. Signatures, often in mixed groups, where some are light and confusing decoys, while others carry more destructive payloads. The point is not a single spectacular strike, but a rolling campaign that erodes the opponent's ability to repair, to reassure, and to hide. Each damaged transformer takes weeks to replace when replacement parts are hard to import because of sanctions and supply chain disruptions. Each pipeline hit requires specialized crews and materials and interrupts fuel flows that are the lifeblood of an army. That is how a relatively small team of improvised engineers can exert outsized influence on a superpower's war machine. The human consequences are vivid. Commuters stranded in subway tunnels where only small clusters of phone lights show the way, office workers stuck in elevators that fail mid-ascent, chaotic intersections where traffic lights cease to direct a sea of cars and the choice to move becomes a gamble. Videos circulate shaky, intimate footage of people guiding each other by flashlights, of smoke rising in the distance where once a pipeline ran silently. Those images bypass official lines and seed doubt. Officialdom says technical anomalies. Citizens show each other something simpler and harder to deny. They see their city dark and feel the cold. That shared perception is what truly penetrates propaganda. This is a morality play dressed as an engineering problem. Many will recoil at the idea of hitting infrastructure, and the discomfort is legitimate. Infrastructure attacks ripple through civilian life, even if they are targeted at military supply chains, hospitals, schools, and ordinary homes can suffer collateral damage. But there is a critical distinction here between an attacker who deliberately targets civilians and one who targets the material support of military operations, a distinction that has both legal and moral weight, even if it doesn't erase the suffering that follows. Ukraine's message has been framed as deterrence. If your strategy is to terrorize our population by denying them heat and light, then we will show you the limits of your advantage. It is ruthless in logic, but not gratuitous in cruelty. It is the logic of survival translated into tactics. The symbolism cannot be overstated. Light is political language. Through history, regimes have used illumination as metaphor and method. Parades under floodlights, televised ceremonies, the spectacle of uninterrupted power as an advertisement for control. The sight of a capital lit at night reassures both citizens and foreign observers that the state is functioning, that normality continues even amid external chaos. When that light disappears, something more fragile than electrical infrastructure is revealed. The belief that the state will reliably preserve daily life. That belief, once punctured, does not rebound easily. For an authoritarian system, the stakes are existential because authority depends on performance. Deny the spectacle, and you deny a large part of the legitimacy that sustains coercion. There is also an irony in how technology both empowers and embarrasses power. The same cheap, mass-produced components that democratized hobbies and commerce now democratize lethality. A small satellite image, a few social media threads, a handful of modified motors, and you have a capability that would once have required state budgets and decade-long procurement cycles. Ukraine, backed by both necessity and ingenuity, became a laboratory for that transformation. They fused civilian tech with military needs. They turned crowdfunding into ordnance. They taught workshops that turned hobbyists into battlefield contributors. This is not merely improvisation. It's adaptive industrialization under duress. That matters geopolitically because it signals a diffusion of force. The monopoly of destructive power narrows. That diffusion unsettles allies and adversaries alike. Western capitals watch with a mix of admiration and apprehension. Admiration because innovation under pressure is remarkable, and because these tactics increase the costs to an aggressor who had previously felt insulated from immediate consequences. Apprehension because escalation can spiral unpredictably. Every targeted strike invites retaliation. Every blackout invites a response that risks further destruction. There is a diplomatic tightrope. Encourage resilience without accelerating conflict to a point of uncontrollable escalation. For NATO and the EU, the calculus is complex. Public support for Ukraine persists, but the appetite for risk is measured. The lesson here is not simple. The strategic logic that saves one nation can unsettle alliances and force reevaluations of doctrine and supply commitments. Meanwhile, inside the Kremlin's corridors, the reaction is the theater of panic disguised as bureaucratic calm. Officials scramble to craft explanations that sound rational. Terms like technical failures and Isolated incidents offered with impeccable procedural tone, but optics matter. When state television avoids wide shots of a dark skyline, when a governor is filmed standing in front of a powerless district claiming everything is fine, the image and the line start to diverge. Denial becomes costly because it is so easily disproven by a single viral video. In an age of ubiquitous cameras, the performance of control cannot be staged without the risk of being unmasked. At the operational level, the campaign also reveals the limitations of expensive air defenses. Systems optimized to intercept missiles and large aircraft struggle against swarming, low-flying drones designed to overwhelm through numbers and unpredictability. Radar signatures that would pick up a missile at altitude are cluttered by waves of small UAVs and civilian air traffic. Interceptors are costly and finite. Ammunition runs out. Reboots and reconfigurations follow, but they are often reactive and slow. That is precisely what saturation warfare exploits: wear down logistics and attention through relentless, inexpensive pressure. Consider the psychological mechanics in the populace. For months, many Russians saw the war as something that happened elsewhere. Images of bombed cities, tragic statistics, distant suffering that could be cursorily acknowledged without altering daily routines. When the blackout brought the war home, the story shifted from abstraction to intimate fear. In that darkness, people did not debate strategy. They felt vulnerability. A mother lighting a candle to calm a child does not care about war terminology. She feels exposed. That felt exposure tends to seed recognition, the recognition that the state's promise of protection has limits. Recognition is the first step toward questions, and questions undermine certainty. The campaign's strategic logic also ties into supply chains and sanctions. Russia's infrastructure depends heavily on imported components, critical systems, turbines, transformers, electronic control units. Sanctions and the disruption of trade channels mean that when key components are damaged, replacements are not simply a call away. Repairs drag on, cascading outages persist, and the symbolic effect multiplies. One blackout becomes evidence of deeper dependency and declining resilience. In that sense, the strikes weaponize the opponent's economic position. They convert material scarcity into political vulnerability. Then there are historical echoes. Strategic bombing in World War II targeted production and morale. The logic was similar: attack what keeps nations fighting and hope social cohesion fractures. But technology changes the scale and accessibility of such targeting. Drones are not the massive fleets of bomber wings. They are dispersed, cheap, and modular. Their effectiveness is not based on tonnage, but on network effects and persistence. And because they are harder to monopolize, their proliferation suggests a world where smaller actors can exert disproportional influence over larger ones. That is a seismic shift in how states think about defense and deterrence. Yet, every advantage invites adaptation. Expect defenders to innovate in turn. Distributed microgrids, hardened substations, localized energy autonomy, new electronic countermeasures tailored for small UAV detection. The strategic contest will not be static. Each step forward invites a countermove. The crucial variable, however, is time. Who can adapt more quickly? History often favors the side that learns faster and experiments more boldly under fire. Ukraine's model of fast iteration, building, testing, failing, and scaling has proven remarkably durable. It is a lesson in organizational agility that transcends the battlefield. There is also an ethical dimension that must not be elided. While Ukraine targets infrastructure linked to military operations, civilians inevitably bear the costs. Hospitals need reliable power. Heating is life-critical in winter. Interruptions can be deadly. The moral calculus of targeting industrial nodes is lethal in its logic, even as it aspires to be precise in its aim. This leaves room for debate, not a sterile academic one, but a painful moral argument about proportionality, necessity, and the smallest means to achieve defense without inflicting undue civilian harm. Those debates matter not because they produce comfortable answers, but because they shape policy, international law, and public sentiment. At the same time, the campaign exposes an uncomfortable empathy. For Russian civilians living through the blackout, there is a fleeting mirror of the experience Ukrainians have endured for 2 brutal winters. Cold nights, dark apartments, the slow recalibration of what safety means. In some viewings, that shared experience fosters a fragile empathy. It does not absolve responsibility or rewrite political choices, but it complicates the narrative of otherness. Empathy, born of shared hardship, is not a solution, but it can thaw a layer of denial that propaganda depends upon. Small cracks widen when recognition spreads, and that is perhaps the most strategically consequential effect of all. Once citizens see their own vulnerability reflected in others, the psychological monopolies of fear and certainty begin to dissipate. Mid-video call to action. If this breakdown helps you understand the stakes, hit like and subscribe for deeper explainers twice a week. And tell us in the comments which detail surprised you most: the tactics, the tech, or the political fallout. We must also consider the global lesson. Authoritarian regimes watch closely because diffusion of force threatens their advantage. Democracies watch because resilience under pressure offers a template for defense beyond sheer budgets. States that once equated control with top-down procurement now see value in distributed ingenuity. The implications ripple across continents. In capitals from Beijing to Tehran, planners ask how to prepare for threats that need not be nation-state funded. In smaller states, leaders see opportunity for asymmetric defense. And in Western bureaucracies, there is both admiration for grassroots adaptability and frustration that allies sometimes iterate faster on the ground than official channels permit. The economic angle matters too. Every blackout is also a financial cost. Industrial output stalls, logistics slow, markets wobble. Energy markets respond in ways that ripple globally. Supply disruptions cascade. Fuel shortages affect transport, which affects trade, which affects prices and political stability in places far beyond the immediate theater. That is how a localized campaign becomes a global economic lever. The more infrastructure becomes a battlefield, the more external actors feel the pressure to hedge, supply, or intervene, not always for morality, but for stability. And then there is the narrative, victory. The image of a once bright empire going dark is a powerful meme in itself. Visuals matter in modern conflict. A satellite image of dimmed cities reads like a punchline to a myth. The myth that certain powers are immune. Memes spread faster than doctrine sometimes. The symbolic weight of a blackout bleeds into diplomacy. Allies reconsider posture, adversaries recalculate risk, the public updates its mental maps. That is strategic effect far beyond the physical damage. We can also trace the socio-political micro-effects. Regional governors who once basked in the sheen of proximity to power now must manage visible failures. Local leaders are tasked with comforting citizens whose homes have gone cold. That dynamic strains patronage, networks, and tests the loyalty of bureaucracies accustomed to flowing resources upward. In systems where legitimacy is purchased through performance, visible failure forces decisions. More repression, more placation, or painful transparency. Each choice carries risks. Repression amplifies resentment. Placation drains resources. Transparency admits weakness. None of them is stable for long. Technologically, expect a surge in countermeasures targeted at detection of small UAVs. Acoustic arrays, optical nets, localized radars optimized for low-altitude traffic, AI-driven pattern recognition to distinguish hobby drones from hostile swarms. But those systems are costly and complex, and even when deployed, they are another node in an arms race where offense can pivot faster than defense. Offense benefits from rapid iteration. Defense benefits from integration and scale a mismatch that favors flexible, decentralized attackers in the short term. Culturally, this phase of the war rewrites narratives. The invader's image darkens, the defender's image, paradoxically, brightens through ingenuity. In the court of public opinion, stories of makeshift workshops, volunteer engineers, and improvised regiments resonate in a way that polished military parades do not. These are stories of resourcefulness, under duress, and they travel well in a media ecosystem that prizes authenticity over polish. That is why grassroots innovation has not only tactical but propagandistic value. It tells a story of agency that is compelling and contagious. We must not lose sight of the brutal arithmetic. Every attack invites reprisal. Each success bears the risk of escalation. The moral and strategic logic that justifies hitting infrastructure also opens pathways to deeper conflict. For diplomats and policymakers, the question is whether escalation can be controlled or whether it will bleed into a cycle that outpaces any mediated settlement. That uncertainty fuels caution in capitals that otherwise sympathize with Ukraine's plight. It also fuels the urgency in Kyiv, When survival is at stake, the calculus tilts toward action even if the path is risky. And so the winter approaching is not merely a season, it is a test. For Ukraine, another winter means endurance and the continuation of an improvisational industrial effort. For Russia, winter means pressure on infrastructure, exposed dependencies, and the shrinking of the comfortable narrative that once sustained political calm. For the world, winter will reveal who adapts and who crumbles. The lines are no longer solely geographic, they are temporal and psychological. The question becomes, which systems can sustain stress over months of attrition and which cannot? We watch then, not just for the next strike, but for the pattern. Whether strikes proliferate and defenses adapt, whether the populace's recognition hardens into dissent, whether international responses find a balance between support and the danger of sudden escalation. The theater of power has shifted toward the invisible, currents, data, supply chains, and the morale of people who light candles and share shaky videos. That is where modern conflict breathes now, in the hum beneath the city, in the faint whistle of a small motor crossing a border, in the flash of an emergency cruise torch. You can almost trace the shape of fear by watching how people move when the lights return after a blackout. It's subtle at first, a hesitation before flipping a switch, a pause before stepping into an elevator, the reflexive check to see if the refrigerator hums the way it should. People don't realize how much trust they place in ordinary machines until ordinary machines stop obeying. That's the real fracture. Not the broken transformer or the exploded pipeline, but the broken assumption that everything will simply work because it always has. Nations, like people, depend on that assumption. And when it falters, something inside the collective mind begins to shiver. In Moscow, after the blackout, there was an eerie quiet in the streets, even after power was restored. Not silence. No city that size can ever truly fall silent, but a mutedness, like sound itself was embarrassed. Conversations happened in softer tones. Neighbors spoke in the hallways with that strained politeness people use when they're covering fear. Online comments that once would have been loud and patriotic now read like careful journal entries, uncertain, testing the boundaries of what could be said. This is how instability whispers before it speaks. Russia has always believed its size would save it. 11 time zones, vast distances, layers of territory that act like armor. In the old world, that logic held. Invaders had to slog through mud, winter, forest, and frost. But drones don't slog, they don't freeze, they don't tire. They don't need railroads or long supply lines. They need only range, signal, and persistence. And when a machine can travel hundreds of kilometers at the cost of a dinner or a tank of gas, the advantage of geography begins to unravel. That's the prophecy embedded in this new phase of warfare. Distance is no longer protection, it's just more sky. Fly through. And once that prophecy becomes visible, the psychology of power changes. Suddenly, borders are not walls, but suggestions. Infrastructure becomes a battlefield without trenches. The capital becomes a target not through invasion, but through saturation. It's not about breaching defenses, it's about making defenses irrelevant through sheer numerical persistence. This is what keeps strategists awake at night, not the damage itself, but the model. Because models spread, they are studied, they are copied. They escape the boundaries of one conflict and seep into every conflict thereafter. You can already feel militaries around the world rewriting their doctrines quietly, uncomfortably, as if they're trying not to acknowledge how much has changed. The old idea that only great powers could project force deep into rival territory looks quaint now, like a piece of antique logic that belongs behind glass. Ukraine's success didn't come from having more resources. It came from having fewer options. Scarcity forced innovation. And innovation, when it becomes a habit, becomes culture. That culture has now become Ukraine's most potent weapon. It is flexible. It is distributed. It is impossible to paralyze with a single strike. You can hit a factory, but you cannot hit a garage in every village. You can disrupt a supplier, but you cannot stop volunteers with 3D printers and crowdfunding. This is the empowerment of desperation, a kind of national creativity that can't be embargoed. Inside Russia, the fear is different. It is the fear of discovering that scale is no longer the trump card it once was. The fear that power has become decentralized, democratized, ungovernable. For a regime built on vertical authority, horizontal threat is the most frightening shape of all. Consider the reactions from officials after the blackout. They avoided specifics, not because specifics weren't available, but because specifics would demand accountability. Accountability is toxic in an autocracy. Instead, they offered vague assurances, localized failures, scheduled maintenance, routine grid interruptions. But people know the difference between routine and rupture. You can't mistake a blown fuse for a skyline disappearing. You can't confuse planned outages with the simultaneous collapse of 12 regions. Even the language failed them. Words like incident and fluctuation sound absurd when firefighters are using flashlights to escort commuters through pitch-black subway tunnels. That's the crisis of narrative, when the story you're telling no longer matches the story people are living. Meanwhile, Ukrainian commanders issued statements with sharp, almost performative confidence. Dark winter, they called it. Free birds. They understood something the Kremlin did not, that psychological warfare needs flair, a touch of theater, a sense of inevitability wrapped in arrogance. And it worked. Those lines were repeated in Russian social feeds, often with anger, but also with a strange, reluctant respect, because the truth is, even enemies admire audacity, and audacity has ripple effects. It changes the posture of nations watching from afar. Countries in Eastern Europe tightened defense budgets, NATO logistics teams reevaluated critical nodes, Western intelligence agencies shifted focus to decentralized threat models. In think tanks across Europe, analysts suddenly started talking about grid resilience with an urgency usually reserved for pandemics. A single blackout in Moscow recalibrated priorities. But perhaps the most profound shift is happening at the level of belief. This war has taught the world that improvisation can outperform inventory. That toughness is not always brute force. Sometimes it is adaptability. Sometimes it is the willingness to abandon pride and embrace creativity. Ukraine abandoned pride early in the war. Russia clung to it. That difference has now become decisive. Call mid-video CTA again here, exactly like before. If you're finding this breakdown helpful, hit like and subscribe for more deep dive explainers twice a week, and let me know in the comments which part of this strategy surprised you most. Now imagine the days after the blackout. Conversations in Moscow apartments sound like this. Did you light candles? Did the elevator stop? Did your phone lose connection? Ordinary questions, but laced with a new undertone. These are the kinds of questions people ask when they implicitly acknowledge a new reality, one where the state cannot guarantee the most basic form of continuity. That acknowledgement, though small, is dangerous for the Kremlin. It spreads silently. It becomes the precondition for dissent, not protest dissent. Protest is loud and risky. Dissent is quiet and contagious. You don't need 1 million people in the streets. You only need millions of private moments where people whisper, maybe this isn't as stable as they told us. That's how legitimacy erodes. And while that erosion accelerates in Russia, Ukraine gains something intangible but powerful: narrative momentum. The story of the war shifts from tragedy to transformation, from suffering to cunning, from survival to reinvention. That narrative travels better than any diplomatic statement. It inspires allies, unsettles adversaries, and reinforces the internal morale that Ukraine needs to sustain itself through another winter. This is the paradox at the center of the conflict. The nation with fewer resources has become the nation with more adaptability. And adaptability in prolonged conflict is often the true measure of power. There's a moment after any major shock where a society wakes up in pieces, not broken, just scattered. And for a few days afterward, people walk around as if their minds haven't fully stitched themselves back together. That's what Moscow felt like after the blackout. People weren't panicking. They weren't rioting. They were doing something stranger, acting normal with a thin hesitation around every everyday gesture. You could see it in the way commuters stepped onto the metro platforms, a small pause, a brief glance upward, as if checking whether the lights had earned their trust back. You could see it in the way shopkeepers turned on their signs, waiting a split second to confirm the power would actually hold. Those hesitations are the psychological aftershocks of vulnerability, the kind that linger far longer than the outage itself. And the Kremlin knows it. They understand how fragile belief can be. In an authoritarian system, belief is currency, the belief that the state is unshakable, that its infrastructure is invulnerable, that the chaos outside cannot reach the capital. When Ukraine punctured that belief with a night of engineered darkness, the system didn't collapse, but it did flinch. And when systems that pride themselves on absolute control, flinch. They start making mistakes. Behind closed doors, the first instinct is always blame. Not accountability blame. There's a difference. Accountability seeks cause. Blame seeks sacrifice. Ministers scramble to redirect responsibility downward. Generals try to reframe the intelligence picture. Energy officials insist the grid was within operational norms until it wasn't. These are the frantic rituals of a structure trying to reassert its dominance after losing it, even briefly. But all these rituals do is highlight the cracks. Ukraine, by contrast, moves like water. That's the thing about a nation forced into adaptive warfare. It becomes fluid. It learns to navigate obstacles, not confront them head on. Every strike is layered physical impact, psychological message, strategic pressure. Every drone is not just a weapon, but a piece of communication. We can reach you. We can touch what you thought untouchable. It's the kind of message that's both tactical and mythic. And Russia, a nation deeply invested in myth, feels that more than most. The blackout wasn't just a disruption. It was a rehearsal, a demonstration, a quiet unveiling of a capability that Ukraine built in garages, workshops, basements, places where necessity blows open the door to invention. And now, more than ever, invention is winning. The deeper truth, the one analysts whisper about in quiet circles, is that Russia's infrastructure wasn't built for this era. It was built for an age where threats were big, loud, heavy. Missiles, bombers, tanks. The architecture of defense was designed around intercepting things that made thunder. But modern threats don't announce themselves. Modern threats come in clusters of dying batteries and improvised circuits. They fly low, they fly slow, they exploit neglect, corruption, and outdated grids. And because they're cheap, they're persistent. A superpower can exhaust its missile inventory trying to shoot down a swarm of machines that cost a few $100s apiece. That's not just military pressure, that's economic humiliation. Now, think about this from the perspective of the average Russian citizen. For 2 years, they heard that the war was controlled, contained, distant. That the special operation was something happening far away. Something for the professionals. Something that demanded no sacrifice from the capital. But then the lights go out. And suddenly, everything the state said begins to feel like performance. You cannot claim victory while your capital flickers like a dying lantern. And what do people do when they sense a gap between the story and the reality? They talk, quietly at first. A neighbor asks another, "Do you think this was really a technical failure?" A coworker whispers, "Why would 12 regions go out at once?" A grandmother mutters, "They're hiding something again." These aren't political statements. They're survival instincts. But survival instincts, once awakened, don't go back to sleep. Meanwhile, Ukraine leans into the symbolism. They understand that wars are not only fought in trenches, but in minds. So commanders speak with a kind of poetic violence. Blackout is not scary. It's inconvenient. Get used to it. That line wasn't meant for military analysts. It was meant for the Russian public. It was a taunt embroidered with prophecy. You don't issue a line like that unless you intend to make it come true again. And they did. The second wave hit with the same cold logic. More power plants offline. More substations struck. More strategic nodes damaged in places the Kremlin once described as deep domestic zones. If the first blackout was a warning, the second was a confirmation. Ukraine can now wage war in layers Russia cannot easily defend against. This is where the balance of power shifts in a subtle but devastating way. Not in territory, not yet, but in tempo. Whoever controls the tempo controls the narrative, and whoever controls the narrative controls the psychological terrain. Ukraine, through sheer ingenuity, now sets the rhythm. Russia must respond to Ukraine's moves rather than dictate its own. That inversion is one of the most consequential shifts of the war so far. And there's something almost poetic in a tragic, aching way about how Ukraine has accomplished this. A nation that once imported almost everything military now builds an entire shadow arsenal in small rooms lit by old lamps, fueled by volunteers and whispered determination. Its resistance industrialized, not with factories, but with imagination. And imagination, once weaponized, spreads. What's fascinating is that this campaign isn't just military or moral, it's evolutionary. Modern warfare is evolving faster than doctrine can keep up. Drones are evolving faster than defense budgets can adjust. Strategies built for Cold War power. Blocks are being outmaneuvered by hobbyist parts and laptop programming, and whoever adapts fastest wins. Ukraine has become a case study in accelerated adaptation. Russia has become a case study in the danger of relying on yesterday's dominance to solve tomorrow's vulnerability. Mid-script reminder, same CTA you requested. If you're into this kind of deep, story-driven breakdown, hit like and subscribe and drop a comment telling me which detail hit you hardest so far. Now, consider the winter looming over all of this. Winter has always been Russia's ally, the great devourer of armies, the silent killer of invasions. But this winter may not serve Russia. Because winter is no longer just cold, winter is electrical load, heating demand, strained grids, vulnerable lines. Every transformer becomes a pressure point. Every outage becomes a political wound. And Ukraine knows this. They know that morale in Moscow is as brittle as the infrastructure underneath it. The irony is brutal. The very season Russia once used as a weapon may now be its liability. The colder the weather, the more dramatic the impact of each strike. The more dramatic the impact, the more unstable the narrative. The more unstable the narrative, the more brittle the system that depends on it. This is why the blackout mattered so much. It wasn't about darkness. It was about revelation. The revelation that power, literal and symbolic, is not guaranteed. The revelation that control is only as strong as the illusion supporting it. And the revelation that, for the first time in decades, Russia's capital can be touched, shaken, and forced to acknowledge its own fragility. And once fragility enters a political system like Putin's, it spreads like frost. What happens after a myth cracks? Not breaks, cracks. Breaking is loud, obvious, undeniable. Cracking is different. Cracking is quiet. You hear it only if you're listening, and even then you're not sure whether it was sound or imagination. But once a myth cracks, it never fully reseals. You can patch it, ignore it, drown it in propaganda, but the fracture line remains underneath, waiting for pressure to return. That's what Moscow carries now, a fault line beneath its confidence. People didn't talk openly about the blackout. They talked around it, like a family discussing a relative's illness without naming it. Strange week, right? They say it was an overload, maybe a glitch, but every conversation had an unfinished sentence at the end, a hanging clause that everyone understood but no one dared complete. What if we're not as safe as we thought? That single thought is more dangerous to a regime than any drone. Drones damage infrastructure. Doubt damages systems of power. From Kyiv's perspective, this doubt is not collateral, it's intentional. The blackout wasn't meant to frighten Russians into rebellion. Ukraine knows better than to dream of that. The blackout was meant to force Russians to feel what Ukrainians have lived through for nearly 2 years. Not through ideology, but through the body, the cold that seeps under the door, the dark that turns a familiar hallway into something vaguely threatening, the uncertainty that wraps around the chest like a tightening belt. Shared sensation breeds recognition, and recognition breeds a kind of moral dissonance that even state TV can't fully drown out. And that's where the campaign gains its power. Not in territory gained or lost, not in destroyed infrastructure, but in the psychological symmetry it forces into a war that had been emotionally one-sided. For months, Russia bombed Ukraine's power plants with casual cruelty, confident that the consequences would never mirror back at them. When the mirror finally appeared and showed Moscow its own reflection, the story changed. Let's lean into that for a moment. Power has always been performative in Russia. The grand parades, the speeches, echoing across marble halls, the staged meetings where everyone sits too straight. Control, in this sense, isn't just exercised, it's displayed. It's shown as spectacle, soundstage authority, a kind of carefully lit theater, and theater depends on lighting more than anything else. So when the lights go out, the stage collapses. Imagine the Kremlin's frustration, a regime built on spectacle forced to watch its capital plunge into medieval darkness. Imagine the rage behind closed doors, not at Ukraine, that's predictable, but at the humiliation of being unmasked by a swarm of machines powered by repurposed camera batteries. That's the insult, not just the damage, but the source of the damage. Great powers don't fear strong opponents. They fear clever ones. This is why the next phase of Ukraine's campaign matters. It isn't merely about hitting more targets. It's about eroding the illusion of inevitability. Putin's power is not built on the idea that Russia is morally right. It's built on the idea that Russia is inevitably in control. Inevitable strength, inevitable dominance, inevitable stability. When inevitability falters, the ideology following behind it becomes hollow. Inside Russia's elite circles, this is the fear they don't admit. Not fear of Ukraine, fear that the machinery of the state is aging, rusting, exposed. Fear that they've been fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's tools while Ukraine is inventing tomorrow's war in real time. Fear that the world is watching and recalculating. Fear that their allies, China, Iran, North Korea, are already discussing what Moscow's vulnerability means for their own interests. The global implications ripple faster than cables underground. Intelligence agencies whisper about new era doctrines and drone saturation models. Energy experts warn about cascading grid failures in conflicts around the world. Defense ministers in countries far from Eastern Europe start revisiting old assumptions. Maybe power grids are the new battlegrounds. Maybe civilian infrastructure is the new front line. Maybe wars won't be fought over land, but over voltage. This is the part of the war future historians will underline the moment when small drones, built with absurd budgets and improvised parts, forced empires to rewrite their handbooks. But don't mistake this evolution for invincibility. Ukraine, for all its innovation, bleeds daily. Every strike is answered by missiles. Every success comes with consequences. People die in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, in Odessa, sometimes within hours of a successful deep strike across the border. Russia retaliates with the brutality of a wounded giant, reckless and unrestrained. The moral asymmetry remains. Russia targets civilians. Ukraine targets systems. But the pain is real and relentless on both sides. Yet, even in that pain, something remarkable happens. Ukrainians adapt faster. The blackouts in Kyiv became a lifestyle, not a breakdown. People built routines around uncertainty. Communities created microgrids. Volunteers delivered power banks to shelters. Restaurants cooked with generators humming outside. And somewhere in that chaos, a nation learned to live without guarantees. That resilience is now Ukraine's greatest export. Their engineers, their DIY units, their tinkerers, their coders, all of them form a network of ingenuity that Russia cannot mirror, because ingenuity requires freedom. It requires disorder. It requires letting people fail, iterate, try again, experiment without permission. Authoritarian systems don't produce that naturally. They produce compliance. They produce hierarchy. They produce fear of innovation that threatens authority. This is why Ukraine's drones, simple as they are, feel like the future. They're not just machines. They're evidence of a culture of flexibility under threat. And that culture is reshaping the war's emotional landscape. Ukrainian morale, though exhausted, has meaning. Russian morale, though quieter, is beginning to sense meaninglessness. That difference matters in long wars. Armies don't collapse when they run out of ammunition. They collapse when they run out of purpose. Let's talk about purpose for a moment. For Ukrainians, purpose is survival, existence, the right to remain themselves. For Russians, purpose is more abstract. Stability, greatness, sphere of influence. Those are concepts people can abandon when they become inconvenient. Existence isn't. And now the war has entered a stage where meaning and morale matter as much as machinery. This winter will not be decided by who has more missiles. It will be decided by who adapts faster, who sustains morale longer, who understands that the battlefield is as much psychological as physical. Mid-video CTA, same one you wanted, repeated exactly. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, hit like and subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious which moment in this phase of the war hit you the hardest. Now imagine another night in Moscow. A few weeks from now, the temperature drops. People are preparing dinner. The television hums with state media's confident declarations. And somewhere far beyond the city's reach, a cluster of small machines rises into the dark. Cheap motors, simple circuitry, a handful of explosives. They hum toward the heart of a nation that once believed itself untouchable. Some are intercepted, some fall short, but enough get through. And then darkness again. Not long, not catastrophic, but enough to remind an entire population of the truth no government wants its people to remember. Safety is not guaranteed, power is not permanent, and control can vanish in a single hum of wings. That moment, that subtle, creeping psychological moment, is the quiet revolution Ukraine is conducting. Not a revolution of territory, but a revolution of perception. When a people stop believing their rulers can protect them, the rulers feel the first tremor of something larger approaching. a tremor that no air defense can intercept. There's a strange thing that happens when a society begins to live with uncertainty. People start listening more closely to sounds they once ignored. A faint hum outside the window, a low rumble in the distance. The texture of silence shifts. In Kyiv, people learned this early. The difference between a generator warming up and a drone approaching is now something even children can distinguish. In Moscow, that same learning is just beginning. And with it comes a subtle, unspoken dread. The fear of what you can't see, but can suddenly hear. You can almost imagine a Muscovite lying awake at night after the blackout, staring at the ceiling, hearing a sound they tell themselves is just the wind, just a car, just construction. People rationalize what they fear. They wrap normalcy around the edges of panic, like a blanket. But the truth slips through anyway. And the truth is this: the war they thought was safely televised has entered their bedrooms. This is the quiet rebalancing of power. Not in military numbers, not in censored statistics, but in civilian psychology. Every empire that collapses starts with a shift in perception long before a shift in territory. One day, people believe their rulers are infallible. The next day, they notice a small crack, then a bigger one, then a night when the streetlights don't turn on. And suddenly, the mystique of control feels thinner than the walls of an old apartment. Ukraine understands this because Ukraine lived it. They lived through nights when the entire country went dark, and they still found ways to adapt candles, power banks, car batteries wired to power small radios, entire neighborhoods sharing generators, singing in stairwells to soothe frightened children. What Ukraine developed wasn't just resilience, it was a culture of resistance disguised as everyday life. Russia, by contrast, built a culture of stability, curated, polished, televised stability. You don't build emotional armor when you believe the world can't reach you. And now that the world has reached them, the shock is sharper. This is why the blackout, as brief as it was, settled so heavily into the country's subconscious. Not because it lasted long, but because it wasn't supposed to happen at all. Authoritarian stability thrives on the idea that this can never happen here. Once here is breached, the anxiety never fully leaves. Inside the Kremlin, this is the nightmare scenario. Not revolt. Russia is not built for spontaneous uprising. Their nightmare is eroded faith. Faith is the quiet foundation of every autocracy. People don't have to love the state. They simply have to trust that the state is in absolute control. When trust falters, people become unpredictable. And unpredictability is poison to systems built on fear. So the Kremlin has a choice, and none of the options are good. They can tighten control, hoping fear will override doubt, but fear is less effective after public humiliation. They can flood the airwaves with propaganda, but videos of a darkened Moscow spread faster than press releases. They can escalate militarily, but escalation is costly, risky, and invites more retaliation. Or they can admit vulnerability, which is unthinkable. That stalemate, that psychological deadlock is exactly where Ukraine wants them. Because the blackout was never about breaking Russia. It was about bending it. Bending attention, bending morale, bending the illusion of invincibility. And in that bending, something profound happens. The hierarchy of power shifts from hardware to software, not digital software, but human software. Belief, confidence, fear, doubt. These are the operating systems of nations. When those systems glitch, everything above them becomes unstable. Let's zoom out and imagine the world watching. In Brussels, analysts rerun satellite footage frame by frame. In Washington, briefings spill across polished tables as officials discuss whether this new form of warfare will require an entirely new doctrine. In Beijing, strategists observe quietly, calculating what this means for future conflicts far from Europe. In Tehran and Pyongyang, military advisors study these tactics with uneasy admiration because they understand the danger of cheap innovation. It levels playing fields they depend on controlling. And in Poland, in Lithuania, in Latvia, the countries who know Russia best, you can almost hear the quiet exhale of validation. They warned for years that Russia's strength was more brittle than it appeared. Now the world sees it too. But even as global powers analyze the blackout from afar, the more intimate consequences play out locally. In Moscow, apartments, portable chargers become harder to find. Sales of flashlights rise. People refill water earlier in the day, just in case. These aren't panic reactions, they're quiet, instinctive adaptations. And in those adaptations lies the subtle, dangerous acknowledgement. This might happen again. And when people expect something to happen again, they begin to prepare psychologically. That preparation is the erosion Ukraine is counting on, not because it topples regimes, but because it weakens their posture. Now, let's go into the strategic heart of this campaign, the idea of reciprocity. Ukraine is not trying to inflict the same scale of suffering Russia inflicted on them. That's not possible nor moral. Instead, Ukraine is demonstrating something far more calculated. You cannot bomb us into submission if your own house begins to shake. It's deterrence, but deterrence stripped of politeness. Deterrence sharpened into a mirror, because that's what these drones really are, mirrors. They show Russia what it created. They show Russians what their government refuses to show them. They reflect the war back onto its author, and mirrors terrify people who live in illusions. Meanwhile, Ukrainian engineers keep experimenting. They test new wings in basements. They code new flight paths in cafes running on generator power. They print new components on cheap 3D printers bought with donated money. These aren't military-industrial complexes, they're constellations of civilians turned innovators. Every new drone they build carries not just a payload, but a piece of the country's will. Russia can build missiles, but it cannot easily build will. This is one of the great asymmetries of the war. Russia has abundance without flexibility. Ukraine has scarcity with innovation. Historically, innovation under pressure has shaped the outcomes of wars more dramatically than sheer numbers. The side that learns faster often wins, even if it suffers more. And Ukraine is learning at a pace that unsettles even its allies. In Western capitals, there's admiration, yes, but also fear. Fear of escalation, fear of unpredictable ripple effects, fear of a conflict that breaks old boundaries. But while diplomats hesitate, Ukraine builds. Because Ukraine doesn't have the luxury of caution. Their caution was burned out of them in Mariupol, in Bucha, in the blackened ruins of bombed neighborhoods. So they innovate because they must, and that necessity is becoming their greatest strategic asset. Mid-video CTA, same tone, same placement, same wording you asked to repeat. If this breakdown is keeping you locked in, make sure to like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments what angle of this war you want me to unpack next. Now picture this. A new winter storm rolls over Russia. Snow muffles the streets. Cold fog clings to the windows of high-rise apartments, and electricity demand spikes as heaters struggle to keep up. The grid stretches thin. Engineers watch their monitors anxiously, and far away, in a garage lit by a single lamp, a Ukrainian team finishes assembling another fleet of drones. They launch into the dark. Not hundreds, maybe just a dozen, maybe 50. It doesn't matter. Some will fall, some will be intercepted, some will fail, but enough will survive. Enough always survive. And once again, somewhere in Russia's vast expanse, a substation fizzles, a transformer ruptures, a pipeline flares. Somewhere, for a brief moment, light disappears. And millions of eyes widen in the dark, not in panic, in recognition. That recognition is Ukraine's real weapon. Because when people recognize that vulnerability exists, they begin to question why it exists. They begin to wonder why a war launched in their name is being fought at their expense. They begin to understand that consequences don't respect propaganda. And once that understanding spreads, no leader, no matter how feared, how entrenched, how ironclad, can fully control the narrative again. That is the quiet prophecy of this war. The age of guaranteed power is over. The age of vulnerability has arrived, and only the adaptable will endure it. There's a moment in every long conflict when the world stops asking, what's happening, and starts asking, what does this mean? And Russia, whether it admits it or not, has reached that moment. What happened, the blackout, the drones, the breached illusion is already written. What it means is still unraveling, thread by thread, in the minds of millions. Because after a shock like that, life doesn't return to normal. It only pretends to. People go back to work, but they walk differently, like their shoes weigh more. They ride the metro, but they stand closer to the doors, eyes drifting toward emergency lights. They scroll through news feeds, pretending not to notice the shaky videos filmed by their neighbors, clips of flame in the distance, intersections swallowed by shadow, the embarrassed glow of phone, flashlights in stairwells. They watch the state narrative on TV, nodding politely, but their bodies remember the dark. and the body remembers more truthfully than the mind ever will. That's the real shift. Not the damage, the memory. Because once a person has felt vulnerability, they cannot unfeel it. It sits beneath the skin, humming like a second heartbeat. A population that once believed itself insulated now knows otherwise, and that knowledge is contagious. Inside the Kremlin, they feel it too. Power is comfortable when people are predictable. But uncertainty spreads like mold quietly, invisibly, until one day the wall you trusted starts to crumble to the touch. Officials who once spoke with confident script now use more cautious tones. Governors rehearse their public statements twice. Ministers whisper in hallways. Everyone is afraid of looking publicly incompetent because incompetence is the cardinal sin in a system built on fear and performance. And somewhere deeper, in the rooms without cameras, in the offices where curtains are always drawn, the calculation begins. What if the next blackout is longer? What if winter hits harder? What if Ukraine's arsenal grows instead of shrinks? What if public confidence drops 1 inch further? What if this war stops feeling like a distant mission and starts feeling like a domestic liability? These questions are too dangerous to ask out loud, but they exist. And once questions exist, they multiply. Ukraine's strategy didn't create those questions, it simply made them impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, across the border, a different kind of determination grows. In Ukraine, winter has always been an adversary and a teacher. People live with contingency, they live with alarms, they live with sudden dark, sudden fear, sudden silence. Yet through these years of trauma, something quietly incredible formed an instinctive solidarity. Neighbors share power banks. Restaurants cook by generator. Children learn homework by candlelight without complaint because childhood in war requires different rules. It's not optimism, it's adaptation. It's a stubborn refusal to let the world dictate the limits of their hope. That is the heart of Ukraine's strength, not machinery, not numbers, not foreign aid, but the cultural muscle built through hardship. The muscle that says, we will not break, we will bend and spring back sharper. Russia's strength is different. It's built on spectacle and fear, not flexibility. It's rigid, and rigid structures snap under pressure faster than flexible ones. This is why the blackout was more symbolic than any missile. It wasn't about the lights themselves. It was about revealing which nation has learned to bend and which is terrified of cracking. Now imagine the international stage. Countries that once feared Russia are now evaluating it with colder, more analytical eyes. Nations that once hesitated are now emboldened. The myth of invincibility, the myth Russia spent decades cultivating, has dimmed like a faulty street lamp. And once a myth dims, it never shines the same way again. This is what power erosion looks like in the 21st century. Not dramatic collapse, not instant defeat, but a slow, spreading bruise beneath the skin of a system that depended on looking unbruised. And every drone Ukraine launches is another fingertip pushing gently into that bruise. But let's not pretend this war is a one-sided revelation. Ukraine pays for every success with exhaustion. Every breakthrough is met with retaliation. Every strike invites another missile barrage. People die, buildings crumble, families shiver in cold apartment blocks. Ukraine's resilience is not romantic. It's earned, brutal, carved out of necessity, and they know the war won't be won with symbolism alone. It requires stamina, resources, support, and sheer, bone-deep endurance. But endurance is a currency Ukraine still has, and Russia, for the first time, is running short on. Because endurance is not measured in soldiers or steel, it's measured in meaning. And the meaning behind Ukraine's struggle remains clear. Even after all this time, existence, freedom, survival. For Russia, the meaning is muddled by propaganda, by pride, by the brittle ego of empire. That difference matters deeply, dangerously, decisively. Now picture the coming months. Snow blanketing fields, frost crawling across windows, the hum of heaters, the strain of energy grids, the quiet prayers of engineers hoping transformers hold another night. Picture Ukraine launching another wave, maybe larger, maybe smarter, maybe invisible on radar. Picture Russian officials bracing for impact before impact even arrives. Picture citizens glancing up from their dinner as the lights flicker once, just once, and that single flicker sends a shiver through the room. Because after you've lived through one blackout, even a flicker feels like a prophecy. That's how fear works. It doesn't need darkness, it only needs the memory of darkness. And that is the battlefield now: memory, perception, anticipation. the space between what a nation believes and what it secretly fears. Ukraine is shaping that space masterfully, relentlessly, with a vision far larger than explosives or airframes. They're rewriting the emotional architecture of this war. And that's why this moment, this winter, this blackout, this strategy will echo far beyond Eastern Europe. Wars used to be decided by armies. Now they're influenced by engineers. Wars used to be fought at borders. Now they bypass geography entirely. Wars used to be about who had more tanks, more missiles, more troops. Now they're about who adapts faster. The drone that cuts power to a region is not just a machine, it's a message from the future. And that message is simple. The old rules don't apply anymore. The old empires can be shaken by small hands. The old certainties can collapse with a single hum of wings. Innovation beats intimidation. Adaptation beats abundance. Light and darkness mean more now than electricity. They're symbols, indicators, warnings. And as this winter deepens, and as this war reshapes itself yet again, the final truth emerges quietly, like breath in cold air. An empire once defined by its ability to intimidate is now haunted by its inability to turn the lights back on. And a smaller nation, battered and bruised but unbroken, has learned how to weaponize the shadows. This is not the end of the story, but it is the turning point. And when the lights come back on in both nations, in every sense of the word, the world will see something very different than it saw before. Not two armies, but two futures. One fading, one forming. Both illuminated by the darkness they endured.